So hello everybody and thanks for joining. Just to say this is Andy Bates here from the Global Cyber Alliance. We're going to just wait a couple of minutes because we've got a bunch of attendees scrambling and joining. So just wait out for 2 minutes and we'll be back with you soon. When we start the webinar, we'll announce that clearly everybody's going to be in mute. And then I think if you've got any questions, there's a chat box there. Please ask questions as you go through. If Shazad doesn't get to answer them as he goes, we'll make sure we wrap them all up at the end. So we'll be back with you in 2 minutes, and thanks again for joining. So we're 2 minutes past the hour, so it's Andy Bates here again, Exec Director, Global Cyber Alliance for the UK, Middle East and India. Thanks again for everyone joining. Just looking down the ever-growing attendee list, it's good to see some old and new friends of the GCA family. So hopefully we've got some good news for you all here today, some interesting conversations. I'll just say, as you all know, we were meant to be having this session on the annual Cyber Trends event. Obviously, for current circumstances, that's been postponed, but we felt it would be good to have some webinars around DMARC and around the toolkit. So the toolkit webinars we've got recordings of from this morning. We're going to do 2 DMARC webinars this afternoon, both of which are identical. This is the first one, and the call will be recorded. So if there are things you think you've missed, we'll be sending you the recording and some follow-on detail pretty well by the close of the week. Again, as I said earlier, for those who just joined, if you have any questions, you can ask questions via the chat box. We've got Ali on standby and myself in both Brussels and the UK able to respond to you. Please ask questions as they go along. Shazad may be able to pick up with some of those as we go. If not, we'll make sure we'll wrap them at the end. So with no more ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague and world-renowned DMARC guru, Shazad Mirra. So Shazad, over to you, please.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much. So again, also welcome everyone to the, and thank you for attending this DMARC 101 webinar. There's quite a few things that we'll be going over in the next hour and a half. And like Andy has said, please feel free to ask any questions throughout the session. I'm happy to answer them if they're relevant to the point that we're currently talking about. If not, like he said, I'll make sure to answer those afterwards. Then if I can't answer them at the end, then I'll make sure to get back to you via email. So the agenda here is we're just going to go over a few things first before we actually dive into DMARC. So I want to give just a little explanation about phishing and the different aspects of phishing to give you a better understanding, because that needs to be clear first before you see what DMARC does specifically for phishing. Then we'll also talk about ongoing management and reporting and analysis, because this is a critical component of DMARC and a key point, and why it's important that to have those reports. And we'll talk about some additional email security mechanisms that can work in conjunction with DMARC and actually utilize DMARC to make it even stronger and for stronger and better email security capabilities. So the first thing, let's go ahead is talk about phishing, right? Because you have to understand that phishing is a very critical aspect and a big vector that's being impacted across the globe. Everyone is impacted by phishing. It doesn't matter who you are, what organization you're part of, what size organization you're part of, but you're always going to get some level of phishing attack. In most cases, companies get at least one phishing email on a daily basis, if not more. So you have various protection mechanisms that you can implement, but yet all of these still keep getting through. And the main problem with phishing is that it can lead to things like infections. It can lead things as bad as ransomware, right? Because for ransomware, email and phishing emails are one of the top vectors in order to get systems infected with ransomware. But it's not only about infections, but this is also go lead to things like fraud, right? Because they could be asking for banking information. You know, they could be asking you to transfer money to this account, you know, because you know you have a late invoice that you haven't paid yet, or they're going to turn off your electricity, or you know, maybe your bank account is going to be closed because you've over withdrawn. You know, those kinds of things that end up coming in. But also they can go as far as getting theft of PII, right? They may not be interested in, right off the bat in getting money from you or infecting your machine or you know, making your machine incapable. They may want to just get username and passwords, because then they can take those username and passwords and try them on various things and to see what can they get into, right? Can they get into your bank account by using the username and password that you just supply them with? And this is why it becomes important about other things, right? Making sure you don't reuse your passwords or use your work email for personal items. But why is this still so successful? Why are people still following it? And the reason is because it is still difficult to determine if the message came from a legitimate source. The messages are getting much better, right? In the past, people would typically look for spelling errors. Well, you know what? The spelling has gotten better in these emails. Look for grammatical errors. You know, grammar is also getting better. So the emails are starting to look better, and they look more legitimate in terms of the message body. But you look at who it's coming from, but typically what people will see is just look at the name that's there and not actually the email address is coming from, right? And this is where it's going to be important that you need to start looking at that from or sender address, because that is what a lot of people are now starting to spoof and have been spoofing for quite some time. So just to give you some statistics, you know, what security presentation do you have without having at least one slide with statistics in them? But this is just to show you again, in terms of phishing, how phishing is still quite prevalent. I mean, you see that the numbers are still high. You know, people are still saying increase. You don't really see decrease as much in here, especially for this year, right? With COVID-19 being COVID-19, there's so many phishing scams going out there in terms of COVID-19. So many people are being impacted by that. So many organizations are being utilized and their names are being utilized in these phishing scams. So when we thought it was going down, it starts going right back up. Now, the other thing that phishing also leads to is business email compromise. And when it comes to business email compromise, or BEC, this is where there's actual money loss, right? A large amount of money is being lost. So you can see here cities anywhere between 1.73 million to $800,000 that were lost, right? And you can make sense. Well, it's a city, right? Well, you know, cities are expected to get phishing emails and to get business email compromises. But look, there's a religious institution. So, right, a church had to deal with business email compromise. 1.75 million were lost because of one business email compromise email. So you can see here from the FBI 2019 Internet Crime Report how many victims are susceptible to phishing, to BEC, and then the dollars that were lost in that. So BEC, $1.8 billion were lost in 1 year. Phishing, not as bad, but still it's quite a high number that in terms of the money lost. So, I mean, this is something you have to take action on, right? I mean, there's only certain things that you can do that will prevent some of this stuff that's going in. And in most cases, what you're doing is you're really protecting yourself from incoming messages. But what you need to do is protect your brand and your organization's reputation by implementing other capabilities. The other thing you need to understand is that there are various types of spoofing, right? And each type of spoofing takes a different protection mechanism to implement, right? So there's display name spoofing. So this is where the name is your company's name. So it could be your CEO's name, your CFO's name that's in there, or it could just say admin. But behind that is actually a Yahoo account. or it's a Gmail or a Hotmail account. So what are the chances that somebody that's using in your organization or someone that's actually using a company name is going to use a Yahoo or Gmail account? Maybe for like a small one-person shop, maybe you're still using Gmail and whatnot, but for mid-sized, large organizations or larger small businesses, you're going to have an actual domain name. It's very rare. It's not often that you're going to get something coming from at yahoo.com or at hotmail.com. Domain spoofing. Now, domain spoofing is where they're actually able to use your domain name. So anything that you do, you're looking at it, the name of the CEO is there, and then it's the CEO's name at yourcompany.com. So it's actually it looks legitimate. This can happen. And a great example, as of late, if you read in the news about the World Health Organization, I mean, not great, but I mean, it's not good either. It's not good, but it's a good example. World Health Organization, their email address is at who.int. That was used for phishing scams and phishing campaigns. And what ended up happening was like the people were getting emails that they thought were actually coming from who.int because the domain name was appropriate. It was the right domain address, and people were giving donations, right? People were transferring funds over. And then the lookalike domain spoofing. This is where they just do a little bit of playing with the numbers and the letters to make it look like it's the actual company name. Because when people look at it really quick, they're going to see company.com. Whereas in fact, that they did was they took the O and replaced it with a 0, and the M is actually R and N. Right here, you can see it a little bit better because we wanted to make sure that it was clear and we made it bold. But when you're looking at it in like an Outlook client or you're looking at it in your Gmail account, the print is going to be a little bit smaller and it's going to blend in together. That R and the N will look like an M. So now display name spoofing and lookalike domain spoofing, there's other mechanisms that you can use to protect against those. But domain spoofing, this is where DMARC comes into play, because it's a two-part process to DMARC, to protect yourself and protect others from things like domain spoofing. So DMARC is your solution in this case. So DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. And in this session, we're going to talk about those 3 key aspects, which is authentication, conformance, and reporting. Those are the 3 topics we'll go into. But overall, what DMARC is going to be doing is it's going to protect your brand. It's going to make sure that people receiving your message know that these messages are protected, and to check these messages. Make sure they're coming from the right source. Make sure they're authenticated appropriately before passing it on to the recipient. So this way the receiver then will take a look at the message. So the receiving server, they'll say, okay, you have DMARC, let's check the authentication mechanisms and see if they pass or fail. If they pass the mechanisms, we'll send the message on to the recipient. If it fails, depending on your DMARC policy level, it'll either go to the junk folder or the message is completely rejected and dropped. But overall, what this is doing, and the major benefit to this, is now preventing spammers and phishers from actually using your domain name for email fraud. Right? This is what this is doing for you. This is preventing people from using at company.com or company.org or whatever your domain email address is. And what that does overall, it'll increase your customer confidence and trust, because they know that messages you're getting are actually valid messages. These are messages that we should be receiving from you. And they don't have to worry about reading in the news that, oh, so-and-so XYZ company has been sending out fraudulent messages. Be careful, watch out, don't click on their emails, or delete them right away or mark them as spam. I mean, in most cases, the email service provider will already do that for them. And then overall, it's protecting your integrity and the brand of your organization in the long run. Some additional benefits are that DMARC is already being used by the consumer side. So what they're using is the second part of DMARC, right? I mentioned the DMARC policy, but there's also DMARC verification. And that's what the receiving side is going to use, they're going to implement to check for all incoming messages to see, is there a DMARC policy applied to this message? So your Gmail, your Hotmail, Yahoo's, and so on, those major consumer-based email providers already have this in place. You know, the end user doesn't know that. So if you have a Gmail or Yahoo or Hotmail account, you actually protect it by DMARC, you're just not aware of it. So overall, it's about 80% of the total number of worldwide email accounts that are protected. And I believe that number may have gone up slightly because more and more email service providers are implementing the DMARC verification side. The other really important part about messages, right? You want to make sure your messages get delivered, right? You want to make sure they get to the person's inbox, not to the person's spam or junk folder, or not even get delivered whatsoever. And we've seen many cases of this where, you know, not only with the World Health Organization, but we've seen cases with hospitals, retail stores, where people or you know, bad actors were using that hospitals and the retail stores domain name and sending out large amount of spam using their names. And what ended up happening is that Google actually blocked all their messages. They started blocking them, so none of their emails would actually go to any Gmail accounts or anyone who had a G Suite account. They were completely blocked. And one hospital actually tried reaching out to us using their account, and it didn't work. They actually had to send us an email using their Hotmail account just to get through to us. So what we had to do for them and work with them is basically go through the DMARC process. We had to get them to the highest level of DMARC before Google took them off of their list. So as soon as that was done, in less than 24 hours, they were off of Google's list and they were able to actually send messages to Gmail users. And that's important. I mean, think about it. It's like, you know, World Health Organization, a hospital, they need to get in contact with their people, right? They need to get in contact with their customers and their clients and the citizens across the globe. So it's really important and critical that their messages get delivered. So by implementing DMARC, you're improving the deliverability of your messages. And then the last thing is the visibility. So, and this is something I'm going to go into a little bit later in terms of reports. Reports are going to be very important because they provide a lot of information to you, and they provide a lot of critical information to you in terms of not only just giving you your spammer and phishers who are in your accounts, but also going to give you information about your own departments. So it gives a nice asset, and it lets you create a nice asset inventory for your email within your organization. So like I mentioned before, there's two parts to DMARC, right? There's the DMARC policy and there's DMARC verification. The DMARC policy is implemented on the sending organization side. And the nice thing about the DMARC policy is that it's free to create. So you don't have to purchase anything in order to create a policy, because you're just using your existing DNS infrastructure. You're basically creating a policy, and in that policy you're defining this is what the actions are, and this is how we're protecting our messages. And I will show you what a policy looks like and go a little bit into it in a few slides later. So the DMARC policy, free to do because everyone has DNS. If you have an internet presence, regardless of whether it's email or if all of you have is a website, you have DNS. So it could be like GoDaddy, it could be your own Windows or Linux-based DNS. You know, there's various options, but DNS will exist. It's just a matter of whether you have access to it. Then there's the DMARC verification, like I mentioned, right? The DMARC verification side is what's going to do the checks of the incoming messages from other organizations to say, is there a DMARC policy applied to it or not? So this is on the receiving side that implements this. So how do you put this in? If you have an email security system, or it's like an email security gateway, it's most likely built into that. It's just a matter of you going in and checking to turn it off. Turn it on. So you put a check mark in there, and that's all it typically requires. Some cases, there may be a few other options where it says, do you want to override the sending organization's policy? You know, if you're going to reject the messages, where do you want to put the rejected messages? Same with quarantine messages. Do you want to keep the quarantine messages before sending them to the spam junk folder, or do you want to just let them go through? But in most cases, it's just typically just a check mark, and then it just follows the sending organization's policy. So there's two parts to this. Which ones do you, sending organizations do DMARC policy, DMARC verification is for the receiving end, but your organization is both, right? You're a sender and you're a receiver, so you need to do both. So you may have seen these if you've been following our Twitter and our LinkedIn accounts, but I wanted to sprinkle these in here throughout just to talk about some of the concerns that people may have and some thoughts that people may have around DMARC. So one myth is that DMARC is only for email domains. That's not true. It is used in terms of email protection, yes, but it doesn't apply just to email domains. You can actually apply DMARC to your web domain in case it's different, because for some organization it is different, right? Because for example, say GC for Global Cyber Alliance, say our website is globalcyberalliance.org, but say for email we use gca.com. Okay, two different domains, right? So we shouldn't just apply DMARC to gca.com for email. We should also be applying a DMARC policy to globalcyberalliance.org. Why? Because that can technically be used for phishing scams and for email. You may not have set it up for that purpose, but an attacker is going to use it for that purpose and can potentially use it for that purpose. So don't apply it just to your email domains. Look at whatever public domains you have, regardless of email usage, apply DMARC policy to it. Now, in order to properly implement DMARC, so the first part, so right, DMARC, we broke it into three components right in the name, right? There's authentication, there was reporting, and there's conformance. So the first component we need to talk about is authentication. So DMARC actually uses two other authentication mechanisms to help it determine whether the message is valid or fraudulent. And those two mechanisms are Sender Policy Framework, which is SPF, and Domain Keys Identified Mail, or DKIM. So these two need to be there in order to work. You don't have to have both, but you have to have at minimum, you do have to have one or the other. Our recommendation is have both. If your email service provider gives you the capability of implementing both of these, do them both, because it'll only enhance your security and further protect your organization and your brand. So what are these? So SPF. So this is what SPF is actually something that's quite commonly used and it's quite widely globally used. And what that is it's going to basically be your list of servers or mail servers that can send using your domain name. Right? Which servers would those be? Those would be obviously your own servers, right? So if you have your own internal servers like Microsoft Exchange or maybe like SendMail, those are going to be servers that are on this list, right? Because those are authorized to send on your behalf. But those could also be other ones like third parties, right? If you're using things like Constant Contact or HubSpot or MailChimp and those kinds of tools to send marketing type messages, you're going to use that. Or if you have CRMs, right, customer relation management systems like Salesforce, right, and you maybe send mail through Salesforce. Salesforce would be something that you would add to this list, right? And so this is very important that you have this list accurate and set up correctly. But you might be thinking, well, I mean, then why can't we just use this? Why do you need DMARC? Because this seems to do everything that it needs to do. Well, it does have some problems when you're using it by itself. One issue is that if you're using a cloud service provider, when you're doing that, you're basically saying that all servers of that cloud service provider are allowed to send using your domain name. Well, those are going to be the same servers that other domains are using. So what's to prevent them from using your domain? If you're using like those shared domain spaces, there's nothing. SPF doesn't prevent that, right? So that's something you have to take into account and take into consideration, because unless you pay for a dedicated server from those organizations, you could most likely be using shared servers and using the same values in your sender policy framework record. So that's one problem with that that comes into play. But what a solution was to rectify that was to use DKIM. Because what DKIM does, it adds a digital signature to every message that is being sent from those servers. So that way there's another layer of authentication to be checked. That can be checked. So that's going to be specific to your domain. Right, so that's what DKIM does. So if you've heard of things like PGP, pretty good privacy, where you can add a signature, a digital signature to each of your own messages. That's more user-based, but DKIM is server-side. So the server is the one that's signing it. So that adds that additional layer. So I'm like, okay, now we have the authorized server. Now we're adding a digital signature, so we should be fine now. Why do we need DMARC? Well, there's a problem also, again, still, is that there's nothing in SPF that says, oh, make sure you check the DKIM value. And there's nothing in DKIM that says to check the SPF value. There's nothing that does that. So they're fully independent of each other. There's no checks and balances between the two. The other thing is that the receiving side has to have SPF verification and DKIM verification turned on. They have to turn it on. And then the other part is that the receiving side then has to make the decision as to what happens to the message if they fail SPF or if they fail DKIM checks. And in most cases, the receiving side doesn't want to make that decision, because what if the SPF just happened to not be set up correctly? What happens if they just forgot to put in the IP address or the domain of the new server they just stood up? Right now, we're blocking all those messages. So this is where DMARC comes into play, because yes, you do have to enable DMARC verification. The receiving side does need to do that, but DMARC is going to say, check SPF to see if they have SPF, check to see if they have DKIM. And if either one of those checks fails, then this is what needs to be done. Based on our DMARC policy, this is what you, as a receiving side, this is what you should do with those messages. Right? So the sending organization is telling the recipient, the receiving side, this is what action to take with these messages, rather than the receiving side having to try to figure out and spend time, is this real? Is this fraudulent? What do we need to do with this? So this is why DMARC is very important and becomes critical. And so that DMARC policy is going to define what happens to that message. So again, the sending organization will create that policy and say in the policy, one of these three levels, that this is what you need, this is what the receiving end needs to follow based on our policy. So the three levels are none, quarantine, and reject. So what are the differences? None. What none does is just, you're basically implementing DMARC, but mainly to collect the reports, to send the reports to see, is there any misconfiguration with our DMARC settings, any misconfigurations with SPF and DKIM to make sure that they don't fail checks. So when you're at level none, nothing is being blocked because of DMARC, right? Messages could still be blocked because of other filters that are in place, but they're not being blocked because of DMARC. So all messages will go, as long as they pass the other filters, will go straight to the inbox. Then you have your two enforcement levels, which are quarantine and reject. So at quarantine, if any of the checks were to fail, or at least one of the checks were to if all the checks were to fail, then the message is sent to spam junk folder. So the recipient spam or junk folder. At reject, if all the checks were to fail, the message is completely dropped and not delivered at all. So the message doesn't even make it to it, unless the server side, they say to keep it, but otherwise it doesn't even get through. So where should you start when you create your policy? Always start at none. Why? For safety reasons. You have to start at none, because I know a lot of people who have said, oh no, we know our email infrastructure, we know everything that we have in place, we're just going to go straight to reject. And this happened to a financial institution, a large financial institution. They went straight to reject, and then about 2-3 weeks later, after implementing DMARC at reject, they got a phone call from the admin of the CEO saying that none of the CEO's newsletters are going out to anybody. People aren't getting them. What happened? What's going on? Problem was that they never added the marketing tool the admin was using to send those emails to their records. So all those messages were getting dropped. So this is why it's important to start at none, review the reports that get generated, and then move up and make your way up to reject. So this is why those reports are very important. So the overall flow and how things run and how things are moving along. So we have first and foremost, obviously, is that you're going to implement DMARC. So you publish a DMARC record or DMARC policy record on your organization's DNS server. Okay, and that's along with the SPF and your DKIM. So all that is going to be in DNS. The sender, so the person who's actually sending the message, all they have to do is type out their messages. They won't even know that any of this is happening unless you tell them that this is in place. But this is completely transparent to the end user. So you're not installing anything special. They don't have to check off something to say, make sure the DMARC policy applies to this. They don't have to do a thing. Again, unless you tell them, they have no idea that any of this is happening. So they just type up their message, they hit send, and the message goes on to their, the organization's email server. So at the server side is where everything is happening, right? This is where all the additional metadata is being added. This is adding the IP address of the server that's sending the email. This is where the DKIM signing is happening, right? This is where that DKIM signing is occurring at this point. And now it sends out, that server obviously sends out the mail to the receiving email server. And now the receiving recipient email server, again, just as a reminder, they have to have DMARC verification enabled in order to see and check for DMARC policies. So DMARC verification has to be enabled. But say DMARC verification is not turned on, right? So if it's not turned on, what happens with the message? Well, the message will still go through the regular filters and hopefully make its way to the recipient's inbox, right? Just because they don't have, there's no DMARC verification turned on doesn't mean it's going to drop the message. It's just not going to check for a policy. It's just going to go through the regular filters and then pass on the email as normal. But if they have DMARC verification turned on, now it's going to check every incoming messages for a DMARC policy to see if that domain has a DMARC policy. So it'll take the domain, it's going to go back out and check the sending organization's DNS server and say, hey, do you guys have a DMARC policy? Oh, you do? Okay, let's go through our checks of SPF and DKIM. Let's see if things pass or fail. So everything passes, or at least one of the checks pass, it goes on to the recipient's inbox. But if all the checks start failing, then as long as your policy is set to quarantine or reject, then the proper policy is followed and the message is sent accordingly to however it's set up. So even if incoming messages don't have a DMARC policy applied to them, so they don't have anything in DNS, they just still get checked. They're just gonna say, oh, there's no DMARC policy. Okay, just go through the regular filters. If there's a DMARC policy, those other filters that you have in place, your spam filters, anti-phishing filters, and so on, those filters are still going to be used. DMARC is just adding one additional layer of filtering to check messages and further protect your organization. And then those reports. So the reports are actually coming from the recipient side. Why? Because they're the ones who can tell you what's actually happening with the messages, right? Because they're the ones that can say, okay, well, we checked the message and this is what passed, this is what failed, this is the checks that it passed and failed, and this is what we did with the message. So they'll be the ones that send the reports back to you. Not all receiving ends will send reports back, right? Because they do have that option. They don't have to send reports back to you. There are some organizations that don't do that. And they have various reasons of their own as to why they don't do that. But you don't expect to get a report back from every single receiving organization that you send email to. So, we talked a lot about the benefits, and but I'm sure people right now are thinking in the back of their heads like, well, there's certain things we need to, this is email, this is we have to be careful and things like that. So I just wanted to go through a few more myths. One, it's a silver bullet. It's not, right? DMARC is not going to cure all your phishing problems or your phishing needs, right? Because earlier I said that, the different types of spoofing that are out there, right? DMARC only protects against one type of spoofing, right? It's only protected that particular domain that you're applying the policy to, right? So, if you don't have a DMARC policy applied to that domain is not going to be protected, right? So if you have variations of that domain, you need to apply a DMARC policy to do those variations as well, right? So if you have a .com, a .org, a .net version, apply a DMARC policy to those, regardless of the fact of whether you use them or not, because you need to protect them, right? And DMARC is still going to inherit some of the flaws of things like SPF, right? Because SPF does have one flaw, which is a 10 domain lookup, but there are workarounds and ways around it to rectify that. But those are things you have to take into account. So don't think that once you implement DMARC, now you're safe from phishing. No, you still need to apply those other phishing, anti-spam, anti-phishing mechanisms, and you need to consider using other secure email mechanisms like DANE or MTSTS. And then make sure also from user perspective, strong passwords, user education, those things still apply. It's not good for privacy, right? But it's not fully true though, right? Because when you're going through this and you're handling things like GDPR or the California Privacy Act, people are concerned, well, it's going to have, IP addresses in there and things and messages information, things like that. And this is something I'm going to break apart again when we talk about reporting. It's really the reports that you would be more worried about, right? Those reports only get sent to whomever you define in the policy to send those to. So don't send them to an untrusted party, right? Send them to a trusted party that that you're okay with sending those reports to. And then in some cases, this is where the reports come back into play. The ones I said where receiving ends don't always send you reports. There's one type of report, there may be some level of privacy concern, and a lot of people, that's the one that a lot of people do not send anymore because they're looking at ways of going around the privacy issues, and I'll explain what those are a little bit later. But the best thing is enable DMARC reporting, but make sure they go to the appropriate recipients. Another myth is that it's easy. It is. I mean, it's easy. It's actually easy to get started, but it's not but it is difficult to finish. So, because it's easy to put in that policy and start off with that level non-policy policy, but when you get into the enforcement levels, that's where it can be a little bit difficult. And we understand that most people get stuck at that area, but there are resources to help you get past that. Find the appropriate guidance. Reach out to us here at GCA. We'll help guide you and point you in the right direction, because it's the reports that end up being the most time consuming in terms of analyzing them and understanding them. And that's where people get stuck the most. Once you can get past that hurdle, you'll get up to reject relatively quickly. It's going to negatively impact my email, right? Because everyone gets scared. I mean, this is an email protection mechanism, right? This is an email authentication mechanism. If we do something wrong, it's going to break. But that's, like I mentioned before, that's only if you go and start getting way too confident and moving up to reject right off the bat, right? You don't want to do that. You want to start off with none, right? Because if you start off at reject and you forgot to add that one server that's authorized to send mail, messages get dropped. So you start off at none and make your way up. But overall, once you have DMARC set up correctly in the proper way, it's going to improve the delivery rate of your email that you're sending out to your partners, your customers, and citizens. And DMARC's only for large entities. No, that's not true. You're sending mail. if you're sending mail, even if you're one person or two person shop, or if you're a Fortune 500 company, you need to implement DMARC, right? Small businesses get attacked. Fortune 500 organizations get attacked. Maybe not to the same level or the same extent, but they're going to do that. They're going to do things that compromise you, regardless of what the size of your organization is. So you need to implement DMARC regardless of which level you're set up to or what size your organization is. So some other concerns that that were not necessarily missed, but not enough resources, right? Implementation can be time consuming. It depends on the size of your organization, right? If you have a large organization that's more global and has multiple subdomains, yes, this could take time. But if you have a nice plan of implementation, you can get through this relatively quickly, but you have to have that proper plan of attack and get the guidance that you need to get you started. And what we've seen historically is that more resources are needed for the analysis of the report. So if you have the proper tools in place, you can get through those reports and make your site way up. The other thing is that mailing lists and mail forwarders do cause issues when it comes to any level of authentication, right? Because what you're basically doing is you have authentication mechanisms like DMARC, SPF, and DKIM set up, and you pass it on to one system. That system then forwards it on. Well, guess what? That system has different information, right? It's a whole new system. It's going to change configuration, change some of the data that's in the email, right? So at that point, it's going to break it. So what the solution to that is there's another authentication mechanism called ARC, Authenticated Received Chain, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. So we got through the authentication mechanism being used. We talked a little bit about, the conformance, right? So we talked about the different policy levels, which are the conformance values. Now let me show you what actual record looks like. So what you're doing is on your DNS system, you're creating what they call a TXT record, a text record. And what this is this is your policy. You're defining and you're creating your policy. So I'm showing you two different ways of putting in the record. So there's a basic way where you just are adding in certain values, and there's complex where you're adding other values that they're not required values, but you can add them and give different values if you choose to use them. If you do not choose to use them, they're fine. It's just the default value goes into play. So really, just to get started, you just need that first basic aspect in there. So you create a text record, give it a host name. Host name is always _DMARC, and then your domain name. And then the value will be like a text box that you can put a value in, where you define things like V equals DMARC1, that's your version. P equals, that's your policy level. So you can see how easy it is to put the policy level in. You just put in P equals none. When you're ready to change to quarantine, replace none with quarantine. When you're ready to go to reject, just replace none or quarantine with reject. That's the only changes that you have to make. Then the other two tags are for reporting mechanisms. So you're defining, using these two reporting mechanisms, you're defining where to send these reports to, which email addresses to send the reports to. Now you can only send the reports to an email within your domain, right? So it's the email addresses for the domain you're creating the record for. You can send it to external domains, so domains outside of your organization, but there's additional configuration that needs to be done. You can't just send them to them, right? They have to be able to accept the report, so there's additional steps to take into place. So you can actually go ahead. I mean, if there's anyone here, you'll get the copy of the video, and so you can just, when it gets to this point, you can just go through this, and if you want to start, you can get started right just by using this. The complex values are the ones that are highlighted in red and yellow. I'm not going to go through those because it just for the sake of time, but those are just, again, additional values you can use to make adjustments and create restrictions and whatnot to your domain. Now, when you create this policy applies to your domain as well as your subdomains, right? So it applies to your top level domain or the domain you're applying it to, and then also automatically to your subdomains. So just be wary of that fact. ongoing management and report analysis. So just to go into the reporting aspect, and again, I mean, if you haven't realized it by now, I've stressed how important reports are when it comes to DMARC, right? Because it's in the name, right? Domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance. So we talked about authentication, we talked about conformance. Now we're doing that one last component of DMARC, which is reporting. So there's two types of reports that are generated. There's aggregate reports and there's forensic reports. Now, forensic or failure reports are the ones you're most likely not going to get. So before I talk about why you won't most likely not going to get it, so what is the actual report? So it's not technically a report. What it is it's really the actual full message that failed or could potentially have failed the DMARC checks. And what I mean by full message, I mean it could contain the header of the message. It'll have who the message was intended for, where the message was coming from, and it will actually could contain the subject and the actual body of the message. So the actual text in the body of the message. And this is where the ones that people are concerned about in terms of privacy. And this is also the one that's why really people have stopped sending the forensic failure reports just for this reason, because they're concerned of what potentially could be in those emails and the fact that where are those messages actually going to. So they stopped sending those. So like Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, and so on, they've stopped sending those types of reports. There are still a few out there, the smaller organizations or some of the the Fortune 500 organizations, they may still be sending them, but the large email service providers are not allowing this feature and allowing them to send the reports. Because that's good. So that again, there's a lot of information that could potentially be in there. So this is just a sample of a forensic failure report. I'm not going to really go through this to explain it bit by bit. So basically, if you don't, I mean, the other thing you can do, just if just to say like, I don't want forensic reports, there's the tag RUF. Do not put that tag in your policy. So if that tag's not on your policy, those will not get generated, and those obviously will then at that point don't get sent. The aggregate reports are the ones that you do want to get. And this is the one that all the service providers actually do send out, or a majority of them actually do send out. And the reason that you want this one is because this is the one that's going to tell you what mechanisms are failing, which ones are passing. So this is the tool, this is the report that will actually tell you that. It'll actually give you a full aggregate of a 24-hour period of what's been happening on that receiving side. So like, for example, if you send a lot of messages to Gmail or G Suite users, you'll get an email, you'll get a report back from Google over a 24-hour period. Like these are the number of messages you sent to Google.com the Google users. These are the IP addresses those messages came from, and this is what happened to those messages. That's all it's going to tell you. So it's not going to have details about the message, right? It's not going to give you the recipient. It's not going to tell you who the original sender was, just the IP address of the sending server. And it's not going to have the message body or anything like that. So it's not going to look anything like this, where it has like the signatures and the subject line and things like that. Now, these reports do come in as zip files, as XML documents inside those zip files. How many reports do you get? It depends on how many messages you send, but it's always an aggregate of a 24-hour period. So meaning like if you send to let's say 100 different domains, you'll get 100 reports back. But if you send to 1,000 Gmail users, you should only get one report back from Google, right? So it's on a domain basis, not on a user basis. And these reports are important because what it's going to give you, again, it's going to give you the IP addresses of the server that's sending using your domain name. So hopefully only that report will only contain the valid servers, right? The ones that you put on your SPF list, or the ones that you know of, and you just have to make adjustments if necessary. But, I'm sorry, before I get into the but, from that, you can now go ahead and create your IT asset inventory as well, right? Because there could be chances that maybe a MailChimp or a Constant Contact or Salesforce pops up and you weren't aware that messages were being sent. So this is where you may have to go and check with the marketing team or the sales team or the CEO, just to make sure that, hey, are these marketing tools, are these things you're actually using? Are you utilizing these, and making them, then you create that asset inventory for yourselves. But every so often, or maybe even right at the beginning, you're going to also get those spam senders. So you get IP addresses of servers that you don't even know what they are. But when you do a lookup on them, or you ask people about them, or you see a domain in there that you don't know what that is, like, why are they sending on our behalf? Those are most likely to be your spammers and phishers, right? So that's also important to know, because that's why, that will hopefully encourage you to move yourself up to quarantine or reject. But also you can actually take that data and use them on your block list, right? You put in those domains. So in case like the domain the domain might not be the email in the email sender, but the domain could potentially maybe be in the email itself as a link, like a clickable link from a different IP or a different domain. You could put those into blacklist or block list, and then protect yourselves from those kinds of situations, in case something were to get through in any way. This is a sample aggregate report. Again, I'm not going to go through this. I mean, it's not recommended to actually try to eyeball this or read this manually. I know some people have, those tend to be the more really technical and programming and coders that tend to read it this way. But it's not recommended. Don't look at it this way. Feel free to go in and open it up and just, out of curiosity to take a look and try to interpret it. But it's not recommended at all to do that. What you want to do is use human readable tools to be able to read these reports. So so this is basically taking this report here and making it easier to read, right? This is much easier. You can now see what domain, you can see IP address, you can see all these other information in here, right? And this is all, in this case, I mean, this is public. So those IP addresses are public, our domain is public, those Google servers are public. So I'm not worried about sharing this. This is all public information. You can go in and find out what servers we're using to use from Google. But this makes it nice and cleaner, because it'll tell you the information that's in there. It tells you how many messages. It tells you what policy is being applied. So this is when we were first starting out. We had our policy at none, but then obviously we're at reject at this point. But it tells you if like DKIM things are passing. It tells you if SPF is passing. But then these reports, you're going to also look for other things. So things like DKIM issues and possible spoofing, right? So this is where it's going to tell you if things are failing, right? Or if there's errors with your DKIM configuration, right? If there's possible spoofing. So here's this mail server that's in, I believe that's Germany is the country, that's Germany. We have no idea who this is. So when our policy was at quarantine, this message got quarantined. Right, but this will tell us like there's no DKIM, or DKIM was none, or the SPF was failing because the domain is not our domain. So these are kinds of things that these reports are going to tell you and assist you with, so that we can go through and review those. This is why those reports are important to go through, because this is what's going to help you move on to the next level. So key things to look for is your SPF passing or failing, right? Is DKIM passing or failing? And the reports are going to tell you though whether they're passing or failing. But there's another thing you have to check for, which is called domain alignment. And that's what the domain alignment is basically checking, is the from address matching the SPF and the DKIM domains addresses? Do they match? Are they the same? So as long as they're the same, you're fine, right? Because remember, the from address, you can spoof, right? You can actually put a legitimate domain in there. But behind the scenes, if those SPF domains and the DKIM domains are completely different, that's going to be a fail. Now, what can you use to check for these reports? There's various options. So we have a list of free options that you can go to and download these, utilize these. There is going to be, obviously, if these, I put free in quotes because there is going to be there could potentially be some level of there could be potentially some level of effort that you have to put in, and it could potentially be some cost, right? Because you may have to put up a cloud infrastructure to run some of these. You may have to put up a server to run some of these. So there's cost in those aspects. And plus, then there's also the cost in terms of time, right? Because you're at this point, you're setting up your own your reporting system to collect these reports, but then you have to go through and manually do the analysis of those reports. Right, so there's things like DMARC analyzers, which you can actually send the reports to, and what they'll do is send reports back to you. Right, so so like Postmark and MX Toolbox will send reports back to you, or summary reports, and you just have to go back and review those, and check those to see see what's going on. So you have to, you'll have to have some level of understanding of those DMARC reports. But again, you can always seek proper guidance to say, hey, this is what we set this up. We're getting the report. We don't quite understand these. Can you help us out? And we're more than happy here at GCA. We're happy to help you with those. You can also use vendors. So there are paid service providers which you can actually send reports to. In some cases, some of these organizations will either give you trial periods, or they have like a very low tier which you can actually use for free, depending on the number of messages that are being sent out. So you can use like the free tier, but then if you exceed that free tier, then obviously there's going to be a cost associated with it. So this is these are a list of quite a few of the providers that are out there. I'm sure there's much more, there's many more that are out there that's not on our list, but this is a good list of vendors that you can go out and talk to if you choose to. Some of these do provide other services other than just DMARC, but they do mainly deal with email security overall. So another thing you need to worry about when it comes to mail and messages, it doesn't, you don't only have servers that you own, right? There are going to be third-party mail sources, and this is why I mentioned before that these third parties are what can potentially make it a little bit difficult to get up to those quarantine and reject levels because of what their capabilities are and what some of the situations are. Many of these actually have now started supporting DMARC. So there's a list of here on the right-hand side, you can see under resources, you see DMARC.io is one, and if you go to the DMARC globalcyberalliance.org website, we have also a list of resources that you can choose to see what some of the vendors that and how those vendors you need to set up certain things. So now, when it comes to third-party mail sources, you're not setting up DMARC with those. DMARC is for your organization. You only apply it at your organization, and you just create that policy. The only thing you'll ever need to change in the policy is the policy level. So or if you need to add additional email addresses or remove an email address. Those are the only things you need to change. When you get those reports, the things you're going to be changing the most are those SPF and DKIM values. Those you're going to probably be changing SPF to add additional IP addresses that are valid servers or domains that are valid servers. For DKIM, you're most likely to be adding additional DKIM records because you're going to be setting up different ones for each mail service provider. Right, so those are where more of the changes are going to become. The DMARC part will stay pretty much static or until you're ready to change the policy levels. But these supporting, like a lot of these vendors will supply you with the information in terms of what needs to be changed, what needs to be modified in order to be able to support DMARC. Now, some things you also need to do. So we talked about, so we said SPF, talked about DKIM and DMARC, right? Because they each solve different things, and they each provide different mechanisms and different capabilities. Right, so SPF validates the sender, DKIM validates the message, DMARC making sure that it's actually the domain that the user is coming from, and it's been authenticated by SPF and DKIM, right? But then there's two other things you want to take into account. So ARC, right? So I mentioned ARC briefly, authenticated received chain, right? If you're doing mail forwarding, if you have mailing lists, this is something you need to implement and put into place. If you do not do either of those, you do not have to worry about implementing ARC. So who are some of the people that would need to focus on things like ARC? Those are going to be probably like universities may have to worry about something like ARC because they will typically have their own mailing list servers that people will send messages to, and the messages get passed on. right? Email service, some email service providers or ISPs, they may need to implement ARC, right? Because they'll have like things like Google Groups or Yahoo Groups. They need to have ARC. So those are the level that you need to do it with. You don't, if you're like a small organization, medium-sized organization, you most likely aren't doing mailing lists or mailing forwarders, so you don't have to implement ARC. I mean, if you're using a third party to do those things, you need to make sure they're the ones who have implemented ARC and inserted ARC into their tool. It's not something that you would have to do. It's nothing you have to set up for your domain or set up in DNS. Then the other one is BIMI. BIMI stands for Brand Indicators for Message Identification. What does that mean? What that means is that when in most cases, when you send an email to a person and then you receive that email, there's an image that's you can see sometimes, and you typically see this if you have Gmail or if you have Yahoo, you typically see like a little image there. Like in some cases, it might be like a letter or maybe the sender's initials, but sometimes there's an image there, right? And that's where it could potentially be BIMI, because what they're basically doing is you have an authenticated image that is also going to be alongside with that message, and that message, so that image is another layer of authentication, right? Because if that image looks different from what you typically receive from those groups, then that's supposed to tell you that, okay, this is not a valid message because the image is now different. So BIMI is still something that is a work in progress. It is something you can implement now if you choose to, right? If you choose to, you can go through the process, put it onto your in your DNS, apply it for your domain, and set up to go through the entire configuration of it. But it may not work right now because there's only a few service providers that actually utilize it. So like Verizon, for example, Verizon owns Yahoo. So Yahoo, for example, is actually using this, but they're only doing it for anyone who sends large or bulk amounts of messages. So a lot of the marketing firms, sales groups that send large emails, they're the ones who are typically that they're allowing and putting these images on. I know Google is going to be starting to support it. Microsoft is going to start supporting it. So it's growing, and it's going to eventually make your way through. So it's something to consider and take into account. If you do marketing, you want to use BIMI. But the thing is that BIMI can only be utilized as long as you have DMARC set up at an enforcement level. So you have to have DMARC policy of quarantine or DMARC policy of reject in order for BIMI to work. Otherwise, BIMI is not going to work, and you're not going to be able to utilize it. So this is like a complete picture and what you can use. I mean, and you'll get a recording of this. So when you get the recording, you get a chance to read the source that's there. It's a great source, the great article where this image has come from. It's a good read because it explains all the different. This gives you again another summary of all the different components at a CSO level. So some additional resources that are available to you. So DMARC.org, great source. Reason why? Because they're the creators and the developers of DMARC. So that's the actual group that went through the process of implementing DMARC. So you have Global Cyber Alliance at your disposal as well. So you can go to dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org. There's quite a lot of information there about DMARC as well. We're also doing a DMARC bootcamp, which actually starts next week. It's going to be at 1 p.m. Eastern, which is, I believe, about 6 or 7 p.m. British Standard Time. But I mean, you're obviously more than welcome to attend. It is free to attend, right? This first session here is going to be similar to what we start off with, but the bootcamp is going to go through 5 weeks, and each week we're going to be building on DMARC, and it's going to get. So week 1 will be a high-level overview, but weeks 2 to 5 are going to be technical. So that's where we're going to actually talk about the implementation, break down the DMARC policy. So what I showed you before in a few slides back, We're going to break that apart. I'm going to tell you even the complex version. What are those optional tags? What do they do? What do they mean? What are those options? I'm going to also do a demo for you as well to show you how to actually create, how to take the SPF record and put it into DNS, how to take the DKIM information and put it into DNS, and how to take DMARC and put it into DNS. And we'll be using Office 365 primarily to do that demonstration as our email tool. And then we do have a YouTube channel as well. So there's quite a few webinars and videos on DMARC Setup Guide. We do have the previous DMARC Bootcamp. You may find some of the videos there as well. And then we also do have some setup guides in terms of how to set up DMARC using Office 365, how to do it for Salesforce, and how to do it for MailChimp. And we do have plans to add additional videos and more resources over time. So that is the entire presentation. I know I'm at the thank you slide, but I also see there's quite a few questions as well. So I want to go through those questions. But just again, as a reminder to folks, any questions that you have, please post those questions in the questions box, and I will answer those questions now. So the first one is, why do we need the RUF? The RUF, it doesn't hurt to get those forensic reports as long as you're only sending them to yourself and not to anybody else. Because that protects you, one, against the privacy issue, right? Because only you're getting those reports, but only make sure you get them to trusted people within your organization as well. But the RUF reports, again, it's going to give you more detailed information because that's going to be the actual message, right? Because in the aggregate report, you don't know which messages are the ones that are potentially being blocked. Because all you know is that this server sent the message, this is how many messages, and this is what passed or failed. But you don't know what happened behind the scenes. If you get an RUF version of it, you'll get the full messaging. You can actually look at the header information and say, oh, this is why it failed. Right? You can say, okay, well, because maybe that particular IP address was missing from your SPF, that you just didn't realize about. You didn't realize. And right, in SPF, you could put a range. So maybe the subnet that you put in is just happened to be wrong, right? You're just missing that one or two IP addresses that were outside of that scope. So the RUF report can give you that full detail and provide you with that detailed information. Yes, and there will be a recording available for this. And we actually do, in case people that come in late, there is another session in about an hour. So if you want to go through the session again, you're more than welcome to do so.
So Shazad, I had a question when you did the DMARC Myths unicorn slide, if I may, that I know a few of the audience may be interested in. You can hear me okay, can't you, Shazad?
Yes.
Brilliant. Could you talk to us about wildcards? Because I know the concept of turning DMARC on for a domain that isn't sending email is important. Is wildcards relevant to that? And could you explain a little bit more, please?
Sure. So wildcards are relevant, but so the way that would work though is how you actually do the implementation, right? So you cannot create a DMARC record for what they call a wildcard domain. So a wildcard domain would be like domain.com. When you create a DMARC policy, it has to be for a specific domain. So you would create one for domain.com, but then if you have subdomains, you can create a policy for each one of those subdomains. So if you have mail.domain.com, you could create a policy for that. If you have sales.domain.com, you could create a policy for that. That becomes a wildcard. But the nice thing is that if you don't, what you could also do is, like, if you don't use subdomains, your subdomains are public, but you don't use them for email, you can create just a DMARC policy at the top level. So at domain.com, create a DMARC policy there. That policy will also automatically apply to each and every single subdomain. The only reason you would ever need to create a DMARC policy for a subdomain is if there's completely different structure or infrastructure in that situation. So that's where you may have to create those, but otherwise that's the case. But that's where, that's where, you can protect those wildcard domains, just create a DMARC policy at the top level. It automatically applies to every single subdomain underneath that.
Brilliant. And I think the reason why I ask, because I know some of the people on the call are talking to some nation states out there. I know the UK government talked about a wildcard for star.gov.uk, which if implemented meant nobody could email being .gov.uk other than the authorized list. I guess the watchword for everybody on the call would be this is kind of the nuclear option, because once you do that and you completely forget an entire government department, then you shut them down, which is often unpopular. But one to think of for the events class, I think. I noticed we've got another question from Seldis there, so I'll let you go for that, Shazad.
Yeah, so what are some of the biggest challenges to watch out with implementation of DMARC? So honestly, I believe the biggest, so there's probably two big challenges. One challenge is those reports and being able to understand those reports. But there, I mean, there's a guidance available for it, but as long, if you don't know that guidance, it's going to be a challenge. But hopefully now you know what that guidance is, so we can technically consider that challenge eliminated. But the other one is going to be making sure that you update those other two regs, the SPF and DKIM, appropriately. So working with those third-party providers and having to go through some of the restrictions or some of the implementation mechanisms that they have to deal with. That's probably one of the bigger challenges in this case, because again, like some service providers, they provide SPF, but they don't provide DKIM. Right, so you can still implement DMARC, but you're relying on them to make sure that the SPF information they gave you is valid. So that I would probably say is the second biggest challenge, is the third-party providers and working with them.
And I think if I can add to that, Shazad, if I may, so a kind of sociological answer to that question is many IT people we have come across don't know that the thing DMARC exists, and many people don't know that anybody can send email pretending to be anyone unless they've got this technology turned on. So often that's a surprising moment when you talk to a CEO and then he would rush to his CISO or his CIO and say, go and turn on this DMARC thing straight away. And often it's just, it's in the corner of the IT industry and very seldom talked about, which is why we're keen to evangelize the things. I think the lack of belief that the internet could be so broken, and then the lack of belief that there's a free solution to solve a problem which people didn't know about, that conversation often goes around a few loops before people get to the stage that Shazad has mentioned, which is, can I turn on SPF on my email platform in the first place? So it's as much a personal challenge as well as a technical challenge, I would say.
Yeah, but again, a lot of these challenges you can get over with if you get the proper guidance. Right, you can reach out to GCA. I mean, there's quite a lot of people out there that can help assist you with this as well. We have a community forum. I mean, I'm sure you heard it. If you haven't heard of the community forum, you can post questions there. So community.globalcyberalliance.org is the site. You can post any questions about DMARC to get that guidance that you need. I mean, and even if you come out to us, I mean, we have connections with various subject matter experts as well in DMARC that we can get further assistance without sharing who you are and your your name, so we can keep you anonymous and protect you that way. So you don't get those sales calls.
I think as well, if we just carry on with the challenges question, because actually this seems really easy and sensible, and there are always challenges. One personal war story I'll share with you all was we found one organization which had a tape backup drive that only sent emails when it had failed. So I think really the big challenge is truly knowing your IT estate, and being an ex-IT director where we had about 3,000 systems, we actually had a system to count the amount of systems we had. So occasionally things do get forgotten. And guess what? This tape drive didn't get included in somebody's DMARC configuration. 2 years later, it did fail. And when do you need your tape drive? When you've had a ransomware attack. So because somebody had a ransomware attack, went to back up the whole company, found out the tape drive had been smoking for the past 6 months and doing nothing, and it had been sending emails, but the company put DMARC at reject, and so they never got through. There's always going to be those corner cases. I don't want that to scare anybody as a reason why not to do DMARC, but it does say a good look at your whole IT estate. And as Shazad said, moving from reporting through to quarantine through to reject gradually. I always say for a UK European audience, it's like driving a manual car that you would never start off in 4th gear. You've got to work through the gears gradually, dip the clutch at the right point, kind of get into the groove. And the tape drive horror story would have been caught had they have looked at their forensic reports, looked at their quarantine state a lot longer, and actually just tested stuff and drilled stuff while they're doing that.
Mute.
Excellent.
So yeah, definitely a great example. But the other thing to also take into account when it comes to DMARC, don't only implement it for yourselves. Talk to your partners, talk to your business partners, talk to your service providers and stuff, then tell them, look, you need to implement DMARC as well. Right? The DMARC is going to be, the more people that use DMARC, the more powerful that it gets, and the more the more better protected the world is going to end up becoming. So don't just do it for yourself, share the wealth. Right? Tell other people about DMARC, let them know that DMARC is critical and important, and that they need to really strongly consider putting this in.
I think as well, Shazad, while we've got a few more minutes, I'll share another war story from a friend of mine who actually builds hotels. And one of the DMARC myths we haven't explored is that many people say DMARC doesn't stop me getting hacked, it just stops people pretending to be me, so it protects my brand and it protects other people. So some people put it down as actually, to Saldis's question, in terms of the challenges, some people think DMARC is an altruistic thing to do. In other words, it helps everybody else, not me. Wrong. So the war story of this friend of mine was he was sent an invoice to pay £26,000 to a company. Naturally, the invoice was a spoof one with different sort codes and account numbers. He paid it, but his bank spotted the anomaly. The money was going to company X. They knew that that wasn't the sort code and account number for company X. So guess what? They emailed him to say, we are suspicious that this transaction could be fraudulent. Do you want to pay it? Because he hadn't implemented DMARC, the hacker responded to that email looking exactly like this guy, right name, right signature, right logo, right everything, and said, yes, please authorize the transaction. So the money went straight into that guy's bank account. And I saw this guy at a party last summer, and he said to me, hey, Andy, you know that you told me to do that thing? Because we'd actually spotted he'd been hacked. We saw some odd aberrations from his email. I called his PA. I said, you need to do these two things now, mate. Turn on DMARC, do this thing called Quad 9. He said to me in the summer, Andy, you know that thing you said to me to do? Yep, didn't do it. How'd it go? He said, I lost 26,000. So, and you just can't go back around that point. So if anybody leaves this call thinking DMARC is a great thing, but there are some challenges and it doesn't help you, it actually does. And we found with the recent COVID scam, not to jump too much onto the bandwagon, loads of people sending emails saying, we've seen your account's been hacked, you need to change your password. All of those are great vectors when people are pretending to be someone else to either attack you or use your name as an attack vector. So we could list loads of other war stories, which I won't do now, but please don't think this is all just about your brand and just about other people. It does genuinely make you a much safer organization as well.
Yeah, that's a very good important point, Andy, because technically it can actually protect you as well. Because if you think about it, right, if you're using like things like MailChimp and Constant Contact or these third-party vendors that are sending mail, where are those messages coming from? They're not coming from your servers, they're coming from their servers. So they're sending mail that will actually go through your email checks, right? Your email systems to confirm whether they're valid or not. So technically those would also get checked for DMARC policy to see if they're actually coming from a valid source or not. So, so in a way, DMARC can indirectly protect your employees as well from your domain that are coming from fraudulent sources.
Great. Well, I hope that's been useful for everybody. I know we've still got some time left. As Shazad said, we're pretty contactable, and the community forum really is the great place to have this conversation. As you've all heard, we've helped to convert over 8,500 people to DMARC. We've 1,500 people so far booked to attend the DMARC bootcamp. Clearly, there are thousands of different IT systems on the planet, and we can't possibly understand those in depth. But the good thing about the community forum and the bootcamps is there will be people who've got tape drives, mainframe computers, quantum computers, all of which are configured slightly differently. And I think sharing that best practice and shared experience on the community forum is brilliant. So So for sure, ask myself and Shazad questions, but if you were to ask it via the community forum, then we want the wider internet DMARC community to see those questions. And some of our partners are DMARC experts and DMARC ninjas as well. They won't be selling you their products. They'll give you answers from a trusted advisor point of view. And, you know, clearly we have Microsoft and IBM and those kind of guys as partners who sometimes like to wade in with some answers. So please, there's no such thing as a stupid question, and we promise not to give you a stupid answer as the community. So please, let's keep the conversation going. But thank you again for Shazad. I know particularly as we're in the Ramadan season, then it's good to have you on board as our guest speaker today. So thanks again, brilliant job everyone, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you everyone for attending, and hope to hear from you about your DMARC journeys. Bye.
Bye all.